Soldiers of Christ arise. We'll sing the first, third, and fifth verse. Soldiers of Christ arise and put your armor on, strong in the strength which God inside lies, strong in the strength which God supplies through his beloved Son. Standing in his great might with all his strength endued, but take to arm you for the fight. But take to arm you for the fight, the panoply of God. That having all things done and all your conflicts past, you may overcome through Christ alone. You may overcome through Christ alone and stand entire at last. Now dismissed for class.
Okay, if you would, go ahead and turn your Bibles to Joshua chapter 7. That is where we're going to go. We wanted to go back and just look at some of the applications from the story we studied from Joshua chapter 6. I would tell you Joshua chapter 6, 7, and 8, just from a narrative standpoint, are tied together. So that should flow, very well. But in order to appreciate what's some of the things being said in chapter 7, you have to have studied chapter 6. And in order to understand chapter 8, you have to have studied chapter 7. So just understand that all this is flowing together. Okay. So the whole story of the walls of Jericho, there's several principles that could come to mind. Before I get into some of the things that come to my mind, though, I wanted to just open it up. And any kind of lessons, of course, I wanted to talk about a quick takeaway from Rahab's salvation. Of course, that's important. And the walls of Jericho regarding salvation. And so there were several things we mentioned, but we see in Rahab's salvation a great model, much like we see from Naaman and his cleansing and others in the Old Testament, where you see how faith working and expressing itself in obedience, we still have the grace and the power of God. So did Rahab, I know we've gone over this, but this is really important. Did Rahab have conditions in order for her to be delivered? Yes. Did that nullify the fact that she was going to be delivered by believing in God and having trust in God? No. In fact, it's the very opposite. It's because of her trust and faith in God being the foundation that we see her obeying Him. Now, having said that, though, her doing things, and I would say that her acting in that way through effort and through submission and surrender and obedience to God, did that nullify in any way the grace of God and the mercy of God? No. If it wasn't for the grace and mercy of God, she wouldn't have conditions through which to be delivered, and she wouldn't even have the opportunity to be delivered, right? And so, and I don't know why that principle seems challenging for some people today. Many of our religious friends, and even I think some of our brethren, the idea of emphasizing obedience, at least if we have a clear understanding of it, should never nullify grace. In fact, it's an expression of God's grace and a response to God's grace, okay? And then on the other hand, as we talk about grace, we need to understand never should we present grace in a way that would undermine that surrendering, obedient faith. Now, if we come to believe that somehow, I don't know of brethren that believe this, but if we were to think that somehow I'm earning or meriting something by my obedience, that's a complete misunderstanding of salvation by grace through faith and what obedience is about, because obedience is from the heart. And that's expressed because we trust God and believe in Him and appreciate Him. Okay, so we see that from Rahab, and this is a great example. So if you look at Joshua chapter 6 and verse 2, again, let's read Joshua chapter 6 and verse 2. The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I've given Jericho into your hand with its king and the valiant warrior." So God has made the provision. Those walls fell by the power and the grace of God. Joshua 6 and verse 2 is a great place for that. Let's read Hebrews chapter 11, though, in verses 30 and 31. Adam, if you could. Hebrews chapter 11 in verses 30 and 31, and that'll take care of these other two things. So we clearly have the power and the grace of God and the working of God. I mean, the walls fall because of God's power. But let's read this passage in Hebrews 11, verses 30 and 31. And let's go ahead and, Adam, go ahead and read that.
By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith Rahab the prostitute with those who were disobedient because he had given a friendly welcome to God.
Okay, think about what that says, though. It says by faith. Could we say by grace? Yeah. But he says by faith. But then he goes on, and by the way, all the way through Hebrews 11, we have by faith and then the action of faith. Okay, so all the way through, Noah prepared an ark. Abraham, trusted God and obeyed God. The same is true here. Rahab took action because she believed. So anybody who you ever hear talk about, try to argue that Abraham was saved by, and this is a wrong definition of faith, but if you ever hear somebody say, well, he was saved by his belief, not his actions, and I've heard that, that's just not at all how the Bible presents believing. Okay, that's the problem, is believing is more comprehensive than that. So there is, trust God, but this is not it's not like a non-doing trust. It's an active trust in God. And that's what Hebrews 11 shows, and that's what we learn from Joshua chapter 6. Does anybody have a question about any of that?
It says there, others were disobedient.
That's right.
So Rahab was obedient.
That's a good point, Ken. So and the fact that they were disobedient meant they weren't trusting God. That's right. That's a good point. Okay. Oh, before I give all that. So any other lessons that come out in your mind regarding Joshua chapter 6? Rachel, go ahead. Speak loud. Uh-huh. Yes. Right. Yes. Yes. So we have this band, I'm just calling it a band, harem, that he puts on, and he says these things remember, Jericho's their first real conquest. So in the conquest, they were to destroy these things. There was a ban. For a lot of different reasons, and one of the things Rachel mentioned, by doing that, by prioritizing, now eventually he will give them spoil from some of the victories. But here, the first place, this ban was to show them the priority of not becoming covetous. Remember where previous generation had come out of Egypt. Israel has always had this struggle. We have that struggle, right? So in doing that, perhaps God, and I think the text indicates that God, in a sense, is trying to teach them a lesson to protect them from themselves, from covetousness. That's right. Anything else? Go ahead, Daryl.
I think a lot of the people that in Jericho believed that Rahab said that they saw
Yeah.
and their hearts melted within them, but
That's
they didn't do anything.
That's a great point. I mean, so if you go back to Joshua 2, you're right, because she says they understood that the God of Israel was God of, everything, based on what they were seeing. And then they melted in their hearts, right? So it wasn't like they didn't believe that God had the power and deliverance. So that would be an example. And this is interesting based on Hebrews 11, and I think this is a very worthwhile point. Sometimes when we hear a lot of people talk about those who are believers and those who are unbelievers. And I know most of the time what we mean, and there is a level of truth in that. Here somebody is, they believe in God. Here somebody is that they don't believe in God, right? And clearly someone who doesn't believe in God is an unbeliever, but you don't have to deny the existence of God to be an unbeliever. And one of the interesting things that happens here that Daryl brings to our attention, and also, by the way, if you read Hebrews chapters 3 and 4, it makes clear, it uses unbelief and disobedience interchangeably for Israel. Well, clearly Israel wasn't denying that God exists. But when they were disobedient, and we saw this in the book of Numbers, you remember, that they would be described as being guilty of unbelief. So I think there's an important lesson there, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier, that the way the Bible describes belief, it's an active belief. So it is trust, and often we say, well, faith is trust. Well, it is trust, that's right. But I think if you look, for instance, in the New Testament at how Paul uses the term faith, and we've talked about this, but this is really important for us to understand. And we see it in Joshua 6. When he talks about us being justified by faith and not by works, he's talking about a faith that is a saving faith, an obedient faith. That's inherent in the idea of believing. That's why James says faith without works is dead. It's not really saving faith. When he says we're not saved by works, he's talking about maybe the law of Moses or any system outside of the gospel through which I would have to be sinless in order to be saved. I'd be saved by my own works. And no, I'm not saved that way. But that doesn't mean there's no obedience. So that is interesting, because it wasn't like they were denying that Yahweh was the God of Israel and had the power to deliver, but they didn't obey him, much like the demons know that God exists. They even tremble, much like the people's heart melted, but they don't surrender to him. So that's not a saving faith. Kimberly, and then who else had your hand up? So, and then I'll come back to you. Sure. Well, I think we have we could probably look out in the world right now, Kimberly, and yeah, well, I know that it seems like a contradiction, but it's really, there are many, many people, if you went up to them and you said, hey, do you believe in God? I think they would tell you yes. They may have convinced themselves that's all that's necessary. I mean, there's all kinds of people that lead ungodly lives. And yet if I asked them, do you believe Jesus is the Son of God? They would say yes, they believe that. But they've been taught doctrines that that's all there is to it. And so that's kind of how they live their life. Well, that's not much different than other people. Let me give you an example. In John 12, you look at John 12 and verses, I think it's 41 and 42, it says there were some who believed on him, but they wouldn't confess him lest they should be cast out of the synagogue. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. Like, you could have a level of, I believe in him, but I'm not giving my life to him. I'm not obeying him. And the way God looks at that, he may recognize that person believes, has a level of belief, but that's not somebody that has actively obeyed me. That's not the kind of faith that saves. And I think that's what James is talking about when he says you have a working faith, obedient faith. That's the faith that saves. That's the kind of faith Rahab had. That's the kind of faith Abraham had, etc. You remember he talks about somebody who, knocks on the door and says, I need help. And you say, I hope everything works out for you. Be warmed and filled. And then go on your way and you don't take action. He's just saying that's not the kind of faith that saves. Okay, I got several hands, so you guys are going to have to remember. Don't let me forget you, Jesse. I had Roger, And Jesse, who else had your hand up? Alan? Okay, go ahead, Roger.
In Acts 16, Paul and Silas said, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved.
Yeah.
People take that, in a lot of cases, literal. That's all you got to do. But it's not. This goes to your point.
Right. Well, in that context, that is interesting because he says believe, but then they were baptized the same hour of the night, right? I would mention to you, it depends on your translation, but at least the New American Standard Bible in John 3:36 uses the idea of those who believe versus those who disobey. Other translations render those who believe versus those who don't believe. It just shows you that the terminology needs to be understood in the context of what Jesus is saying. Jesse, and then I'm coming back to Alan.
16:16. I'm going to read the King James. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
But if you look at this word believeth, it's two believers. They're spelled the same way. And you really couldn't tell, just like you said, it says, he that believeth, and I'll talk to people about this, and they'll say, believeth. And he that's baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned. They'll say that all you have to do is believe. You don't have to be, well, if you look at this, how it really is, it says, he that trusts and is baptized shall be saved, but he that obeyeth not shall be damned.
Yeah, that's really what he's saying. And you know what, let me mention that. I'm glad you brought that up. This is one of the arguments you get when you're talking to friends about whether you need to be baptized to be saved. And Mark 16:16 often comes up. Now, by the way, that's not the only passage in the book. There's a whole slew of passages, but let's take that one. They'll say, yeah, but it doesn't say he that doesn't believe and is not baptized, or he that believes and is not baptized. Well, it doesn't have to. They're assuming there's a third category. There's only two categories in that passage. One is those who believe and are baptized, because if I believe in him, I will want to do what he says. And those who don't believe. This goes back to the point. Not necessarily saying, yeah, of course, if you deny Jesus, the Son of God, you're not going to be saved. That's true. But if I say I believe in him, but I don't do what he says, then I'm not really functioning in an active way in trusting him the way I need to trust him for salvation. That's right. Alan, go ahead.
You touched on it, I think, the fact that I was her and that culture has impact her
Right.
and
That's true.
So I think let's
Right. Well, let's talk about that for a minute. So there's several women you could think of, and I hadn't thought of this till you just said this, but it kind of there seems to be a good similarity between Rahab and the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, because in a sense, both, I think, probably had somewhat of a scandalous, background for a lot of different reasons, probably. Both. You would have thought, now the woman at the well was, but you would have thought would have been more hostile, but end up receiving by faith. And both end up leading other people to the Lord. So you're right, she was, but that shows what I'm talking about. That's what saving faith does. It's active. So it's not just mental assent. It involves that, but it's not just believing a concept. That should transform us and change us. Right. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. So here's some lessons and some of these we've talked about. We see obedience to God's instructions, as we've discussed. There's faith and patience. I mean, Israel has to wait. This doesn't happen immediately. They have to follow God. And there's a power in unified effort. They're working together to do what God has asked them to do. That's always been God's purpose. We saw that throughout the book of Numbers as well. We see overcoming fear with courage, moving forward with boldness and courage, even in the face of fear. We have God's timing. I mentioned that. That's something that comes out of this. We see the power of praise, even with this being a military conquest. Prior to the actual movement from a military standpoint, you see how central worship was to Israel. I mean, even as these things are going, the ark and the priests and all of that is very important. We have the destruction of idols, which includes that covetousness. By the way, Paul says covetousness can be described as idolatry in Colossians 3. So if you think about idolatry, that's its philosophy. We see the power of redemption and grace, especially as you think about Rahab. We see victory through trust, not force. So yes, God's power expresses itself, but there is real trust that has to happen. Obedience in detail. Some people say, well, oh, you're just being too detailed. Think about what Rahab did. She followed God's instructions because she trusted him, and she was faithful in that way. And the same is true of Israel. And then we see breaking strongholds in our lives. Somebody might have looked at the walls of Jericho and said, no, this isn't happening. But we see the power of God in all of that. So let's get to Joshua chapter 7. That all sounds great. Joshua 7 is really a very important chapter that we're getting into, not only in the book of Joshua, but there's so many foreshadows here and things that are important principles. So that all sounds good, but we get to Joshua chapter 7. And what is going to happen in Joshua chapter 7? Yes. So God had been very clear about this ban, you might call it. But we're going to find out. It doesn't take Israel very long, does it? So you have your first conquest, and you think, this is what I'm thinking, here we go again. You know, there's somebody in the camp, and a man by the name of Achan, that doesn't follow God's instructions. And there are some really important lessons here. So let's notice Joshua. Mike Binko, if you would, just read Joshua chapter 7. And let's read down through 1, if you would, read verses 1 through 5. And then, Jody, if you could read verses, tell you what, just go ahead and do 6 through 12, if you would.
But the children of Israel committed a trespass regarding the accursed things. Achan, the son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took of the accursed things. The anger of the Lord burned against the children of Israel. Now Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is beside Beth Aven, on the east side of Bethel, and spoke to them, saying, go up and spy out the country. So the men went up and spied out Ai. And they returned to Joshua and said to him, do not let all the people go up, but let about 2,000 or 3,000 men go up and attack Ai. Do not weary all of them, for the people of Ai are few. So about 3,000 men went up there. They fled before the men of Ai, and the men of Ai struck down about 36 men. They chased them from Ai as far as Shebarim and struck them down on the descent. Therefore the hearts of the people melted like water.
Then Joshua tore his clothes, fell to the earth on his face, the ark of the Lord. He and the elders of Israel, they put dust on their heads. Joshua said, alas, God, why have you brought the people over Jordan all? Look, verse 7. Oh, that we had up to the other side of the Jordan. Oh Lord, what shall I say when they return back? Canaanites and all the inhabitants hear it. Cut off your name. Then what will you do for your great name? So the Lord said to Joshua, get up, fly out of dust on your face. Israel has sinned, have also transgressed my covenant, which I commanded. They have even taken some of the accursed things, both stolen, and also put it among their own stuff. Therefore the children of Israel but turn their back before them. Neither will I be with you anymore unless you destroy the accursed.
Thank you. Bo, if you would, read verses 13 through 15.
Get up, sanctify the people, and say, sanctify yourselves for tomorrow, because thus says the Lord God of Israel,
morning, therefore, you shall be brought according to your tribes. And it shall be that the tribe which the Lord takes shall come according to family. The family which the Lord takes shall come by household. And the household which the Lord takes shall come man by man. And it shall be that he who is taken with the accursed thing shall be burned with the fire, he and all that he has, because he has transgressed the covenant of the Lord, because he has done a disgraceful thing in Israel.
Okay. First of all, what are your thoughts about this particular story? And secondly, does it raise any questions for you that you think may be important for us to talk about? Go ahead. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's almost like we'll just go over there and take care of this little group. We can do this on our own. Yeah, there is that feeling, certainly. Roger?
Blessing first. What do we do?
And if that had happened, perhaps God would say, hey, you might not want to go right now because you've got a problem here. Okay, so there's that. What else? There's something, and I will tell you there's a principle in Joshua 7 that is, massive as far as understanding it regarding, also understanding the rest of the Old Testament, especially this early section, and also us understanding our relationship to one another and to God in the church. So, who had your hand up? Go ahead, Jody, and I'll come back to Alan.
Going down the road, talking about it. Achan's sin, our sin, can affect others. Because of Achan's sin, they lost 36 men.
Yeah.
And it was because of his sin.
Right. So and we're going to dig into that. That's a really important principle so think of it in the sense of a community or family. Achan's sin, and the text is very clear about this, could be described as Israel's sin, even though not every Israelite did this. Okay. And so you might say, well, wait a minute, is that fair? We'll talk a little bit about that. Because God, of course, holds individuals responsible, but there is a level of responsibility for the group to carry out God's will regarding that accountability. Okay? It also indicates that we as individuals have identity in covenant and relationship with God in the body or family or community. Okay? So the idea that I can be for instance, in the New Testament, I can follow God at large, and I don't have to worry about being part of the local congregation. I don't have to worry about other people. I don't have to worry about accountability in that way. Okay, how does that work, really? Like in real time, when you read Joshua 7, just as a big principle. Okay, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that more. Anybody, Alan? Yeah. Yes. I think as Westerners, we have a hard time with that especially, probably more than people in other areas of the world might, because we are so individualistic. Individualism is so important to us. And there's a level of this where you go, okay, as far as me having a relationship with God, there's a very personal aspect of that. But, we've seen to our demise, I think, the dissolution of, families. We've seen our communities just ripped to shreds with division. There are results of not appreciating this principle. Just on a basic level. And so when you go back and you look at this, there's something very valuable, I think, here that we want to talk about as a local church. I know this is the Old Testament. This is a principle about how God interacts with his his people. Okay, I got a couple of hands. Go ahead, Jesse.
This is very application for each one of us. We have to ask our right questions. It was everybody's fault. It was Joshua's fault. It was all of Israel's fault. This happened. These men died because they didn't ask the right questions.
That's right.
And the problem is that's what we do. We don't ask the right questions. We just follow people. And that's what happened. We need to let God give us. And that's what happened today. And Matthew 7:21 says that these people will question Jesus when they died.
Yeah.
He said, why did we do these things? They didn't ask the right questions, and they didn't do the right thing. Just like we today, we don't ask the right questions.
Well, let's go to that. So, negligence. God holds negligence from a group standpoint responsible, but he also holds individuals who actually commit the act. But sometimes, I've heard even people in certain local churches where decisions, completely unbiblical, ungodly decisions were being made, and it's kind of like, well, that's their decision, not mine. Well, no, it doesn't work that way. Jody, go ahead.
1 Corinthians 5,
Yeah.
where the man followed God. Church was congregation. Individuals are doing things error. It brings a bad name to that congregation.
Yeah, and sin, I think you looked at my charts, but sin has that effect because he talks about it spreading. And it doesn't mean everybody was going to say, oh, let me go live with my father's wife. It was the tolerance of that as though it were acceptable. And that can spread in different ways, and it did in the Church of Corinth. But we'll come back and talk about that, but that's fair to certainly consider. Okay, let me just mention a few things here. It is interesting to me, and I think I mentioned this to you, how that Rahab is the outsider and she ends up being an insider, and Achan was an insider, and because of his sin and rebellion to God, look at the difference in Rahab and Achan. Rahab trusts God. Rahab obeys God. Rahab gives herself to his mercy. Achan, who should have done differently, does not do so. And as was mentioned when you look at Joshua 7 and verse 1, but the sons of Israel acted unfaithfully in regard to things under the ban. Now that's talking about Achan. Okay? He specifies really Achan, but he says there's a sense, and we'll talk about a phrase in a minute, and I know it's kind of a phrase we might not use a lot, but if you hear the word corporate, sometimes you'll hear people talk about corporate worship. Corporate just means we're doing this as a group, okay? You think group if you hear that. So corporate, we'll talk more about this, is quite a bit in the Bible. Corporate identity means I have a personal identity because I'm part of that group. Now, if we're talking about the church, we're members of the Lord's church. I individually serve God, but also serve God within the family of God, okay? And so this principle, you're going to see it more. This principle really comes out here. Now, if you look at chapter 6, and we've read that, but chapter 6, verses 17 through 19, Achan was clearly violating a prohibition against these things, and he was not, now this is important, disobedience shows a lack of respect and reverence for God. He wasn't holding God as being holy. That's what this is really about, is sanctifying, and he's going to say to Joshua, God's going to say, rise up and consecrate yourselves, sanctify yourselves, because this sin was among them. So apparently Achan acted fundamentally alone, and we'll talk more about that, but the verse twice mentions the Israelites as the guilty party. So the one man's sin, in a sense, the consequences clearly had affected the whole group, even though they had not themselves done exactly that. So you have, but the people of Israel broke faith. Does anybody have a different rendering of that? Committed a trespass, acted unfaithfully. So the idea of faithfulness is the idea of allegiance to God and reverencing God and serving God. So the people had broke faith, specifically Achan, which had results. Notice this, the Hebrew word harem, or band, some of your translations will use. It's talking about devoted things. These things were to be devoted to God, and yet Achan, rather than devoting it to God, wanted it for himself. And where did he put it? He hid it. Where did he hide it? In his tent. So, I'll go ahead and get this question out there, and I don't know the answer. I know there's only a couple of answers there could be. So later on, when you read about consequences and they come to Achan and it cost Achan his life, it also, I think the text indicates it also cost his sons and daughters. Does it say that his wife was put to death as well? That's what I've always thought, but it doesn't mention his wife. It mentions his sons and daughters. Y'all might want to fact check me here. What verse is it, Rachel? 24. They burned the city with fire. Oh, no, I'm in the wrong chapter. Number 7. I didn't think that sounded right. I went Conley on you, didn't I? So, verse 24. Then Joshua and all Israel with him took Achan the son of Zerah, the silver, the mantle, the bar of gold, his sons, his daughters, his oxen, his donkeys, his sheep, his tent, and all that belonged to him, and they brought them up to the valley of Achor. So, I don't know. Maybe we're supposed to understand his wife was also part of that. I probably have read it that way. Or his wife wasn't there. I mean, she could have died before then. Or the only other option I can think of, Adam? Oh, yeah, it was quick. Consequences were quick. Yeah. Yeah. Right. That's important. Anybody have an idea about this wife to go along with that? Uh-huh. All that he had would include a spouse, or she's not there. That's possible. Okay, now, this is a third option. I'm just telling you, we don't know. I mean, it doesn't say, but I'm telling you, it doesn't say his wife, which seems a little odd. I mean, often, like when you're talking about what a man had, they'll kind of list off things. Now, it's possible that she was executed, and it mentions his sons, and the fact that it specifically mentions his sons and daughters seems a little interesting to me. Doesn't mention his wife, mentions all his gold and silver. So if the wife was there, it could go under all that he had. It could be, and I'm just telling you from the reading idea, this is another option. It doesn't say, so you can go just think about it. But you have to ask, why were his sons and daughters put to death? Go ahead.
I mean, how impossible would it be to hide that big piece of gold without someone seeing it?
Exactly.
Taking it all the way from there back to the tent. Someone had to see it.
I don't know if we'll get there today, but there are numerous passages. One in Deuteronomy. I feel like there's another one in Numbers 5, that clearly say, if you knew, as a family member, if I knew you were doing something like this and I didn't express that to the leadership, that I was responsible for that, okay? So my personal conviction, regardless whether his wife just isn't mentioned, but she was put to death, or she wasn't complicit, and it just doesn't mention her, or she had died of natural causes before, we don't know. It doesn't mention her specifically, but the bigger point is about the sons and the daughters. And I believe, because some people read that, I'm telling you, skeptics will read this and say, well, what a cruel God, he just took his kids. And no, I think the clear implication is they had been complicit, and I don't know how they wouldn't be if they didn't report it to the leadership when you have him bringing it to the tent and burying it in the tent. I mean, you know, you're not talking about a huge space here. They would have known. Now, did they do it? Did they actually do it? No. Were they complicit in it by hiding and defending the sin and making this difficult for Israel? Yes. So Achan fundamentally did it, but there were other people involved. Okay? Go ahead, Kim. And I think that's a big point too, because, and we don't always appreciate it the way the Jews would have. Sometimes the worst punishment you can imagine is if you're a Jew, your descendants having this punishment. So this is going to be an infamous story in Israel and a warning to all of Israel to be held accountable. Go ahead, Sarah. Yeah, it is. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah. Right. That's a good point. That's right. Well, and there's a lesson there for parents and children, but especially as we become more adult children, we're responsible to serve God first too. I mean, that's a really powerful lesson. That's right. Be sure your sin will find you out. And it did. Rob. Yeah. Right. Yeah, yeah. Well, he says that in numerous passages, and we'll get to that, Lord willing, next Sunday. But there are numerous passages, and not just Ezekiel 18, that's the one that comes to my mind, but you also have a passage in Deuteronomy that says God won't do that. Like he's not going to take an innocent, in this case, you know, here your dad did some evil thing, and let's say you didn't want him to do it. Let's say you even said, hey, my dad's doing this terrible thing. Well, this wouldn't have happened to them. So there's individual responsibility, but it's kind of interesting. There's individual responsibility even in that corporate kind of group context. So just because I'm in a group context doesn't mean I don't have any responsibility involved in that. That's just somebody else's problem. So did Achan bear the brunt of the responsibility? Yeah, but his sons and daughters also had to deal with this. Go ahead. Yes. That's right. That's right. So, yeah, let's talk about that. Right, so the 36 who died, Taryn was saying, they didn't hide the stuff, and I don't think they had anything to do with it from what I can see. There are people who get hurt with sin that weren't necessarily involved in this sin. That doesn't mean their souls were in jeopardy. But, I mean, let's take terribly ungodly parents and children that are innocent, and they get hurt by those parents. And vice versa. Parents can be hurt by their children. Evil hurts innocent people. And we are abundantly aware of that. Now, those who are hurt can be right with God, and we want to be right with God so that if that occurs, we still have eternal salvation. But I do think that's a valuable point here, too. That's another lesson to draw from this particular context. Go ahead, Darryl.
We need to be careful when we apply human wisdom to God's judgment. Those 36 people that died in battle because of Achan's sin had nothing to do with Achan. They
Right, right.
That's not fair. But we can't pass judgment on God's righteousness.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Before we end, let me do this. I think a lot of them did. We haven't gotten there yet, but yeah, that would be the only reason, wouldn't it? So let me repeat what Kevin said. You know, you have this large group of Israel. God knew who it was. He could have just said, hey, Achan did it. But, and we'll read this more next week, but he brings, you know, clan by clan, family by family. They had to be witnessing this to show the judgment that was brought, and eventually it gets to Achan's family, and he involves them in the judgment. I mean, look, we've seen this before in Numbers. If God just wanted to throw a plague on Achan, he could have done that. But he involves them in the judgment, which is going to make them aware. We see a similar thing in Acts 5 with Ananias and Sapphira. And we'll talk more about that. Alan, before we end, you get the last word. Well, I'll agree. I agree with you in principle. We're going to look at this next week, but there's some passages in Deuteronomy and Leviticus 5 that make me think that they were complicit. But whether they were or not doesn't change the fact God has a right to offer judgment. Yeah, we'll talk about that next week.